When the war ended, the captured German generals still carried pride. They believed they had only lost to luck, not to strength. But one afternoon in 1945, under the blazing American sun, they were driven past a U.S. tank plant. Through the open gates, they saw rows of Shermans rolling out one every 15 minutes.
Their movements
The thunder of engines drowned out their silence. Their faces fell, their pride cracked. One whispered, "We never fought an army, we fought a factory." That moment, they finally understood wars aren't won by courage alone, but by the nation that never stops building. May 15th,
It's what keeps them going.
1945, railway station, Eastern Front. The morning mist clung to the abandoned German command post like smoke from dying fires. General Friedrich Steinberg adjusted his torn collar, trying to maintain the dignity his uniform once commanded. Beside him, General Klaus Weber stared at the approaching American jeeps with calculating eyes, while General Otto Friedrich clutched a leather briefcase containing maps that no longer mattered. "Gentlemen," Steinberg said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 lost battles. "Remember who we are." The American soldiers approached with professional efficiency, no hatred in their eyes, no triumphant sneers, just men doing a job. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, a farm boy from Iowa with calloused hands and patient eyes, gestured toward the waiting transport vehicles. "Generals, you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. My orders are to escort you to a processing facility in Illinois." Weber laughed bitterly. "Processing. Like cattle." Mitchell's expression didn't change. "Like prisoners of war, sir. There's a difference." As they climbed into the train car, clean, functional, nothing like the cattle cars they'd heard rumors about, Steinberg caught Weber's eye. The unspoken message passed between them. We were betrayed, not defeated. Our technology was superior. Our tactics were sound. If only the Reich had more time, more resources. The train began moving through the German countryside, past bombed-out factories and silent villages. But as they crossed into Allied territory, something changed. The landscape remained intact. Farms showed signs of prosperity. Children waved at the train without fear. "Look at this," Friedrich muttered, pressing his face to the window. "No bomb craters. No rubble. It's as if the war never touched them." Weber scoffed, safe behind their ocean walls while Europe burned. But Steinberg noticed something else in the American soldiers' demeanor, not the arrogance of conquerors, but the quiet confidence of people who'd never doubted their cause. The young corporal distributing water moved with purpose, treating even enemy generals with basic human dignity. Camp Alisville, Illinois, June 1945. The POW camp stretched across the prairie like a small, well-ordered city. Barracks stood in perfect rows, each building identical to the last. American guards moved along perimeter paths with mechanical regularity, not the harsh goose-stepping of Wehrmacht patrols, but a rhythm born of routine rather than fear. Steinberg watched from his barracks window as Private James O'Connor, a young guard from Boston, checked the fence line. O'Connor whistled softly while working, pausing to wave at a group of German prisoners tending the camp garden. No shouted orders. No display of power. Just a man doing his job well because that's what men did. "Fascinating," Weber observed, joining Steinberg at the window. "In our camps, discipline came from fear of consequence. Here, it seems to come from pride." Steinberg finished. "They take pride in doing things correctly." The daily routine revealed this difference everywhere. Meal distribution happened precisely at scheduled times, but without the rigid ceremony German forces demanded. American soldiers demonstrated equipment maintenance to prisoners, who showed interest sharing knowledge with former enemies as naturally as breathing. Captain Daniel Hayes, the camp commander, embodied this strange efficiency. A mathematics professor before the war, Hayes ran the facility like a complex equation where every variable had its place. When Steinberg requested additional writing materials for his journal, Hayes approved the request without suspicion or power games. "Why?" Steinberg asked during one of their brief conversations. Hayes looked up from his paperwork. genuinely puzzled. Why what? General, why treat us with such consideration? Hayes set down his pen, choosing his words carefully. Because that's how Americans fight, sir. We don't win by becoming our enemy. We win by remaining ourselves. That evening, Friedrich discovered the camp library American soldiers had donated thousands of books, including technical manuals about engineering and manufacturing. German prisoners studied these volumes eagerly, not for escape plans, but out of genuine curiosity. Look at this. Friedrich showed his colleagues a manual about assembly line production. They treat manufacturing like military strategy. Every process optimized, every worker a specialized soldier. Weber remained skeptical. Propaganda. They want us to believe in their superiority. But Steinberg noticed something troubling in his certainty. For the first time since his capture, doubt crept into his thoughts. Not about German courage or fighting ability, those remained unquestioned, but about something larger, something he couldn't yet name. July 20th, 1945, Camp Headquarters. Captain Hayes stood before a map of the Midwest, marking locations with red pins. Behind him, 3 German generals waited with poorly concealed curiosity. The invitation had come without warning. A tour of American war production facilities for the purpose of educational documentation. Gentlemen, Hayes began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he'd used in university lectures. The War Department has authorized a series of facility visits. You'll be documenting industrial capacity for POW intelligence reports. Weber's eyes narrowed. And the real purpose? Hayes smiled not with malice, but with the confidence of someone holding winning cards. Perhaps you'll tell me when we return. Lieutenant Thomas Reynolds entered, carrying a clipboard thick with authorization forms. Reynolds was younger than most officers, barely 25, with the lean build of a distance runner and eyes that missed nothing. He'd grown up in Detroit, where his father worked the Ford assembly lines before the war transformed car factories into weapons manufacturers. Sir, Reynolds addressed the generals with formal courtesy. Transport will arrive at 0800. The tour will include the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, the Willow Run Bomber Plant, and the River Rouge Complex. Friedrich recognized the names from intelligence reports, targets they'd never been able to reach. Manufacturing centers that had remained mythical throughout the war. The Reichsbombers had never crossed the Atlantic. American production had remained theoretical, a number on paper rather than observed reality. You think this will impress us? Weber asked, his tone mixing skepticism with genuine curiosity. Reynolds consulted his notes. That's not my concern, sir. My job is documentation and escort. What you think about what you see is between you and your consciences. That evening, the 3 generals sat in their shared quarters, studying what little intelligence they possessed about American manufacturing. The numbers seemed impossible: thousands of tanks per month, hundreds of aircraft weekly, ships launched daily. Propaganda, Weber insisted. But his voice lacked its usual conviction. No nation could sustain such production. Steinberg traced figures in his notebook, calculating ratios of population to output, resources to production timelines. The mathematics were disturbing if even half the reported numbers were accurate. German industry had been outproduced by margins that made tactical superiority irrelevant. Tomorrow we'll see the truth, Friedrich said quietly. Whatever that truth might be. Outside their window, the American flag snapped in the prairie wind. Unlike the dramatic banners of the Reich, this flag seemed to wave with casual permanence, not demanding attention, but simply existing with quiet authority. Detroit Tank Arsenal. Chrysler Corporation. The convoy of military vehicles approached the factory complex under a sky heavy with summer heat. Even from a distance, the facility dominated the landscape, not like the underground bunkers and camouflaged plants of German industry, but bold and exposed, as if daring the world to challenge its purpose. Reynolds pointed through the windshield as they crested a hill. The Detroit Tank Arsenal. Chrysler converted their automobile production lines in 1941. They've been running continuous shifts ever since. The sound hit them first, a deep, rhythmic pounding that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Not the precise, mechanical noise of German manufacturing, but something organic and alive, like the heartbeat of some massive creature. As they passed through the main gate, Friedrich pressed against the window, his breath fogging the glass. Mein Gott. The factory floor stretched beyond sight, a landscape of steel and sparks where thousands of workers moved in choreographed precision. Assembly lines carried Sherman tank hulls in various stages of completion, skeletal frames becoming armored bodies, empty shells receiving engines, turrets rotating into position with mechanical grace. Weber counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. Every 15 minutes, a completed Sherman tank rolled off the final assembly line, fully fueled and combat-ready. The mathematics were staggering: 4 tanks per hour, 96 per day, over 35,000 per year from this single facility. A foreman approached their group, Jack Sullivan, a broad-shouldered man whose hands bore the permanent stains of industrial work. Sullivan had overseen automobile production before the war and adapted those same principles to tank manufacturing without missing a beat. "Gentlemen," Sullivan said, his voice carrying over the factory noise, "welcome to the arsenal of democracy. We'll be touring the main production floor, then the quality control section." Steinberg found his voice first. "How many workers?" "About 40,000 on rotation. 3 shifts, round the clock. We haven't stopped production since Pearl Harbor." Friedrich did rapid calculations in his head. German tank production relied on skilled craftsmen building individual vehicles with meticulous care. Each Tiger tank represented hundreds of hours of specialized labor. Here, the process was broken into simple, repeatable tasks that could be learned in days rather than years. "Your workers," Weber observed. "They're mostly women." Sullivan nodded proudly. "Rosie the Riveter. Isn't just propaganda, General. When our men went to fight, our women came to work. They've been outproducing the world ever since." They watched a young woman, barely 20, guiding a massive rivet gun with expert precision. Her movements were economical, efficient. No wasted motion, no uncertainty. Beside her, an older woman checked welds with instruments that would have impressed German engineers. "In our factories," Steinberg said quietly, "we sought perfection in each piece." Sullivan heard the comment and turned. "Here, General. We seek adequate performance in massive quantities. A pretty good tank that exists beats a perfect tank that doesn't." The tour continued through quality control, where sample tanks underwent stress tests that would have destroyed many German vehicles. But these weren't precision instruments of war. They were tools, built to work hard, break occasionally, and be replaced quickly. Statistical Review Room. Arsenal Administration Building. Reynolds spread documents across the conference table like a general deploying maps. The numbers were printed in simple black ink on white paper, nothing dramatic or propagandistic, just data presented with bureaucratic neutrality. Sherman tank production. All facilities combined, Reynolds read. 1944. 774 units. 1948. 11,424 units. 1944. 17,565 units. 1945, to date, 8,053 units. Weber's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glasses. That's nearly 40,000 tanks in 4 years. From all manufacturers, yes, sir. Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, American Locomotive Company, and others. Steinberg compared these figures to his own intelligence estimates. German tank production had peaked at approximately 1,500 units annually, and that was counting all variants, including the massive Tiger tanks that required months to build and constant maintenance to operate. "Show them the comparative analysis," Reynolds instructed his aide. The next chart was devastating in its simplicity. German industrial capacity versus American output, presented as bar graphs that told a story of overwhelming disparity. Where German production lines struggled to replace losses, American factories were producing surplus vehicles for allies across multiple theaters. "We built perfection," Friedrich said slowly, his voice barely audible. "You built enough," Reynolds nodded. Perfection is the enemy of good enough, General. A Tiger tank might destroy 3 Shermans in combat, but if we're building 20 Shermans for every Tiger, the mathematics favor volume. Weber studied photographs of German tank production facilities, underground bunkers, camouflaged workshops, facilities designed to hide from Allied bombers. Then he looked at images of American plants. Exposed, brightly lit, massive structures that proclaimed their purpose without shame or fear. You weren't afraid, Weber realized. Of what, sir? Of being bombed. Of being attacked. You built your factories in the open because you knew we couldn't reach them. Reynolds considered this. Geography helped, certainly, but I think it was more than that. We built openly because we had nothing to hide. This wasn't about conquest or domination, it was about getting a job done. Steinberg traced his finger along production timelines, following the curve of American manufacturing acceleration. The pattern was clear. While German industry peaked early and then declined under bombing and resource shortages, American production had climbed steadily throughout the war. We fought craftsmen, Steinberg murmured, using words that would haunt him for years. You fought engineers. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of the factory floor, a sound that had continued without pause for 4 years, that would continue after the war ended, after the generals returned home, after the world tried to make sense of what had happened. Friedrich closed his eyes, finally understanding the magnitude of their miscalculation. We prepared to fight a European war, with European methods. But you turned war into industry. POW barracks. That evening, the 3 generals sat around a small table illuminated by a single overhead bulb. Outside, the Illinois prairie stretched into darkness, but the distant glow of factory lights reminded them that America never slept. Weber paced the narrow space between bunks, his movements sharp and agitated. Superior numbers don't negate superior quality. 1 Tiger tank could destroy 5 Shermans, and when those 5 were destroyed, Friedrich replied wearily, they built 10 more. When the Tiger broke down, and they always broke down, there were no replacement parts, no spare engines, no way to repair them in the field. Steinberg wrote in his journal, documenting thoughts that military censors would never see. We created weapons of war. They created tools for victory. There's a difference. Weber stopped pacing. You're talking like defeatists. No, Steinberg said without looking up from his writing. We're talking like realists. For 4 years, we wondered why our technically superior forces couldn't achieve decisive victory. Today we learned why. Friedrich picked up a pamphlet Reynolds had given them, a simple recruiting poster showing American workers of various ages and backgrounds, all contributing to the war effort. Look at this. No Übermensch. No superior race. Just people doing their jobs. Exactly, Weber exclaimed. No ideology. No higher purpose. No waste, Steinberg interrupted. While we spent energy on ideology, they spent it on production. While we divided people into categories of worth, they turned everyone into contributors. The conversation was interrupted by voices from the corridor, American guards changing shifts. Their casual conversation drifted through the thin walls, discussions of baseball scores, letters from home, plans for after the war. Normal people living normal lives while casually maintaining the most powerful military-industrial complex in human history. Friedrich opened the window, letting in the night air and the distant sound of machinery. Listen to that. Those factories are still running. Right now, at midnight, they're building tanks and planes and ships. Not because they have to, but because that's what they do. Weber slumped onto his bunk. In Germany, we stopped production every Sunday for religious observance. We closed factories for party rallies. We diverted resources for ceremonial purposes, and they just worked, Steinberg said. Every day, every hour, every minute. Not with fanfare or ideology, but with the same dedication a farmer brings to his fields. Outside their window, Lieutenant Reynolds walked his evening patrol, checking security measures with the same methodical attention to detail they'd observed at the factory. Even in this routine task, he embodied the systematic approach that had proven so devastating in industrial warfare. Weber finally sat down, his anger deflating into something closer to wonder. We thought we were fighting soldiers, but we were fighting. What? A way of life? A civilization, Friedrich said quietly. We were fighting an entire civilization that had decided to win. Educational briefing room. The next morning, Reynolds entered carrying a thick portfolio of photographs and documents. Unlike military intelligence materials, these images showed the human side of American war production workers arriving for dawn shifts, families sharing rationed meals, children collecting scrap metal for recycling drives. The War Department wants you to understand how this production was achieved, Reynolds explained, spreading photographs across the table. Not the mechanical processes, but the social organization. The first image showed a riveting team at the Willow Run bomber plant, 2 women and an elderly man working with perfect coordination on a B-24 Liberator fuselage. Their faces showed concentration, pride, and something else. Ownership of their task. Steinberg studied the photograph intently. In our factories, workers followed orders. These people, they seem to understand what they're building and why. Reynolds nodded. Industrial democracy, General. Every worker knew their contribution mattered. They weren't just following orders. They were partners in victory. Another photograph showed a farm family husband away at war, wife managing crops with help from teenage children and elderly neighbors. Their barn displayed a sign, "Food for Freedom." Your entire population mobilized, Weber observed. Without coercion, Reynolds added. No secret police, no forced labor, no threats. Just people choosing to do their part. Friedrich pointed to an image of Detroit assembly line workers. These women, they're building tanks in the same factory that produced automobiles. How quickly did the conversion happen? Chrysler retooled their main plant in 6 months. General Motors converted even faster. They treated it like any other engineering problem, challenging, but solvable. The most striking photograph showed a massive rally at a Boeing plant in Seattle. Thousands of workers surrounded a newly completed B-17 bomber, not in military formation but as a crowd of individuals united by common purpose. Their faces showed satisfaction, pride, and grim determination. This is what we never understood, Steinberg said slowly. In Germany, we mobilized the state apparatus for war. You mobilized society itself. Reynolds pulled out production charts showing not just military equipment, but civilian goods maintained throughout the war. Americans never stopped being Americans. They just became Americans at war. The assembly lines that built tanks on Tuesday built farm equipment on Wednesday. Weber examined a photograph of a woman welding tank armor, her hands steady despite the dangerous work, her face protected but determined. In our propaganda, we portrayed war as heroic struggle. Here, you made it look like work. Hard work, Reynolds corrected. Important work, but still work. Americans understand work. The final document was a simple chart showing productivity increases across all American industries during wartime. Unlike the dramatic spikes and crashes of wartime economies, the American pattern showed steady, sustainable growth. You didn't just fight a war, Friedrich realized. You improved your entire economy while fighting a war. Reynolds gathered the materials, preparing to leave. General, my grandfather always said that Americans don't like war, but they're very good at it. Today, you've seen why. We treat war like any other problem, something to be solved with good organization, hard work, and the right tools. POW Barracks, August 1945. Steinberg sat at the small wooden desk in his quarters, fountain pen poised over clean paper. Outside, morning reveille played across the camp, but his attention focused entirely on the letter he'd been composing for weeks in his mind. My dear son, by the time you read this, you will know that Germany has surrendered and your father has become a prisoner of war. I write not to explain our defeat that will be documented by historians, but to share what I have learned about victory. We believed courage could overcome numbers. We were wrong. We believed superior technology could substitute for superior production. We were wrong. We believed the will to fight mattered more than the ability to supply that fight. We were wrong about everything that mattered. Today, I toured an American tank factory. In one afternoon, I watched them produce more armor than your entire division possessed. Not through superior engineering or revolutionary techniques, but through systematic organization and relentless efficiency. The Americans won this war in their factories, not on their battlefields. While we trained soldiers to be warriors, they trained citizens to be producers. While we sought perfection in our weapons, they achieved adequacy in massive quantities. Your generation must learn what mine refused to understand. Victory belongs not to the bravest, but to the most productive. Not to the strongest, but to the most persistent. Not to the most brilliant, but to the most organized. Learn how to build, my son. Learn how to organize. Learn how to work with others toward common goals. These skills will serve you better than any military training. The Americans have shown us that free people, properly organized, represent a force more powerful than any army. Remember this. The future belongs to those who can create, not just destroy. Your father, General Heinrich Steinberg. He sealed the letter carefully, knowing it would be read by censors but not caring. Truth had its own power, regardless of who observed it. That evening, Reynolds made his routine security check of the barracks area. Through the window, he noticed Steinberg writing by lamplight and paused to watch. The scene struck him as profoundly human, a defeated general trying to make sense of his defeat, not for his own sake but for future generations. "Lieutenant?" Steinberg called softly. Reynolds approached the window. "Yes, General? May I ask you a question?" "Of course, sir. How old are you?" 25, General. "And what did you do before the war?" Reynolds considered. "I was finishing my engineering degree at the University of Michigan. I planned to work in automotive design." Steinberg nodded slowly. "After the war, I'll probably return to Detroit. Help convert the tank plants back to automobile production. It shouldn't be difficult, they're essentially the same processes." "The same processes," Steinberg repeated. "Yes, I suppose they are." Reynolds sensed deeper meaning in the conversation but couldn't quite grasp it. "Is there anything you need, General?" Steinberg held up his completed letter. "Just this. A father's attempt to help his son understand what we could not." Later that night, Reynolds read the security copy of Steinberg's letter. The words stayed with him long after his shift ended. Here was an enemy general, a man who had dedicated his life to military excellence, acknowledging that the war had been won by people like Reynolds' father, who had simply shown up for work every day and done their jobs well. Camp Aliceville, September 1946. 15 months after his capture, General Heinrich Steinberg walked through the camp gates carrying a single suitcase and a folder of documents certifying his completion of democratic re-education programs. The Illinois prairie stretched before him, golden in the autumn sunlight, as peaceful as it had been the day he arrived. Captain Hayes stood at the administration building, reviewing departure paperwork with characteristic efficiency. "General, your transportation to New York is arranged. The ship to Hamburg departs Thursday." Steinberg shook the captain's hand with genuine respect. "Thank you for everything." Hayes smiled. "Just doing our job, General. I hope you found the experience educational." As his transport vehicle drove toward the train station, Steinberg watched America pass by his window one final time. In small towns, he saw the same systematic organization that had characterized the camp and the factories: clean streets, maintained buildings, people going about their business with purpose and dignity. They passed a lumber mill where workers were processing timber with industrial efficiency. No guards watched them. No propaganda posters motivated them. They simply worked because work needed doing. The mill's output probably exceeded the production of entire German industrial districts. At a rail crossing, they waited while a freight train passed car after car loaded with goods moving across the continent. Coal, grain, manufactured items, raw materials, the lifeblood of a continental economy flowing freely through arteries of steel. "Amazing," Steinbeck murmured. The driver, a young corporal from Ohio, glanced in the rearview mirror. "What's that, General?" "Your trains. They run on schedule, carry everything efficiently, Connect every part of your country. In Germany, we had excellent engineering but could never achieve this level of systematic organization, the corporal shrugged. It's just the railroad, sir. Been that way since before I was born. That casual response encapsulated everything Steinberg had learned. To Americans, these marvels of organization and efficiency weren't achievements to be celebrated, they were simply how things worked. The extraordinary had become ordinary through generations of systematic improvement. At the train station, Reynolds appeared to handle final security procedures. Over the months, a strange respect had developed between the German general and the young American lieutenant. "What will you do now, General?" Reynolds asked as they walked toward the platform. "Try to rebuild. Try to teach what I've learned here." Reynolds nodded. "And what have you learned?" Steinberg considered the question carefully. "That power comes not from commanding others, but from organizing them. That victory belongs to those who can create, not just destroy. That free people, working together, represent a force more powerful than any army." The train whistle sounded in the distance. Soon, Steinberg would begin the long journey home to a Germany that no longer existed, carrying lessons from an America he had never really understood until it was too late. Detroit Tank Arsenal Museum, September 1966. 21 years after his capture, Heinrich Steinberg returned to Detroit as a private citizen. His hair had turned completely white, his uniform replaced by a simple business suit, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. The factory that had once produced Sherman tanks was now a museum, its assembly lines preserved as monuments to American industrial achievement. A young tour guide, barely 20, born after the war ended, led a group of visitors through the exhibit halls. At peak production, this facility produced one Sherman tank every 15 minutes. Over 40,000 tanks total between 1,942 and 1,945. Steinberg followed the group silently, remembering his first glimpse of those assembly lines 2 decades earlier. The machinery was still, but he could almost hear the rhythm of production that had once filled these halls 24 hours a day. In the main exhibition hall, a restored Sherman tank sat surrounded by photographs and documents. A placard read, "Built by the hands that built peace." The words carried weight that the young guide couldn't fully understand, the recognition that these machines had been instruments of liberation, not conquest. An elderly man approached Steinberg, extending his hand with a warm smile. "You look familiar. Weren't you here during the war?" Steinberg hesitated, then nodded. "I was part of a prisoner tour in 1945. My name is Heinrich Steinberg." The man's eyes widened slightly. "Jack Sullivan. I was a foreman here during the war. I remember you. You asked a lot of questions about our production methods." They stood together before the memorial tank, 2 old men who had been on opposite sides of the greatest conflict in human history, now sharing memories of something larger than their individual experiences. "What brought you back?" Sullivan asked. "Curiosity," Steinberg replied. "I wanted to see what you built after the war." Sullivan gestured toward the museum displays. "Same thing we built during the war, really. Cars instead of tanks, but the same principles. Good design, efficient production, reliable performance." Steinberg walked to the memorial wall, where thousands of names honored the factory workers who had contributed to the war effort. Women, men, immigrants from dozens of countries, people of all ages united not by ideology or nationalism, but by simple dedication to doing their jobs well. "You won the war here," Steinberg said quietly. "Not in the battlefields, but in places like this." Sullivan nodded. "We just did what Americans do, we worked. Nothing more complicated than that." As the tour group moved on, Steinberg remained before the memorial wall. He placed his hand on the cold metal, feeling the weight of history and the power of collective human effort. Around him, the museum continued its quiet work of education, teaching new generations about the power of organized democracy. Outside, Detroit hummed with industrial activity different from wartime production but carrying the same essential rhythm. The city had transformed its war plants into peacetime factories, its military precision into civilian prosperity. Steinberg walked slowly toward the exit, pausing at a final display case containing a simple quotation from Franklin Roosevelt. "The arsenal of democracy must be built by free hands and free hearts." In that moment, he finally understood the complete meaning of his defeat. Germany had been conquered not by superior force, but by superior principles. Not by better soldiers, but by better citizens. Not by more powerful weapons, but by more powerful ideas about human potential and social organization. Final fade. The camera slowly pulls back from the museum, showing the Detroit skyline against the setting Sunday. In the distance, factory smokestacks rise like monuments to human industry. The sound of machinery different now. Building cars instead of tanks carries on the wind. The war is long over, but the principles that won it continue to build the future. Wars are not won by the bravest or the strongest, but by the most organized, the most persistent, and the most united in purpose. America's greatest victory was not defeating its enemies, but remaining itself while doing so. The tanks are silent now, but the lessons they taught echo through generations. That free people, working together, represent a force more powerful than any army ever assembled.